Welcome everybody. My name is Margo Smith. I'm Director of Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection. Welcome to the Beyond Dreaming Symposium on behalf of Kluge-Ruhe and our partners in this endeavor, the Institute for Global Humanities and Cultures, the Embassy of Australia, and the Vice Provost for the Arts. I invite you to join me in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're on today, the Monacan people, and paying respects to their elders past, present, and future. It's my pleasure to introduce Jody Kilbasa, Vice Provost of the Arts, a true champion for the arts at UVA. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Margo, and hello everyone. The arts are thriving at the University of Virginia, especially the Indigenous arts of Australia and the Americas, in no small part due to Kluge-Ruhe Director Margo Smith and Curator Henry Skerritt's great work, along with our university's unique partnership with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Museums play a central role in introducing students to people, cultures, and ideas that they might not encounter otherwise. For the past 20 years, Kluge-Ruhe has brought Indigenous artists and scholars, curators, and knowledge holders to the university to share their experience and expertise with students and our greater community here in Charlottesville. Working with our many partners, the Kluge-Ruhe has generated truly amazing projects, student-curated exhibitions like Beyond Dreamings, the rise of Indigenous Australian art in the United States, collaborative arts projects with leading artists like Judy Watson's Experimental Beds, student research at Indigenous-run art centers in Australia, such as that conducted by third year at Callie Collins last summer at Nillumbimby. This symposium, which has drawn a national and international audience, is evidence of the far-reaching impact that a focused museum like the Kluge-Ruhe collection has in cultivating global recognition and appreciation of Indigenous Australian art, and UVA is very proud to serve as host. One last thing I want to share with you. It is a dream of mine that in the very near future, the Kluge-Ruhe and the Fralin will be separate institutions under one roof with shared resources. So I welcome all of you in helping me realize that dream in the future. And with that, I'd like to welcome Margo back to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. I share that dream. In 1988, the exhibition Dreamings, the Art of Aboriginal Australia at the Asia Society Galleries in New York catapulted Indigenous Australian art onto the world stage. Dreamings was the first major introduction of Aboriginal art to American audiences and represented a turning point in its international reception. Anthropologist Fred Myers describes it as the moment when Aboriginal art emphatically became fine art. Dreamings also signaled a radical shift in the way Indigenous artists and communities were represented in the modern museum. This symposium celebrates 3 decades since Dreamings, reconsidering its historical moment and examining its legacies. We're so grateful to all the participants who have taken time from their busy lives to join us for a few days of lively conversation about Aboriginal art. The symposium grew out of an exhibition at the Kluge-Ruhe collection curated by 9 graduate students as part of a course last spring taught by Kluge-Ruhe curator Henry Skerritt. They are Lucia Columbari, Cecilia Gunsberger, Eliza Hodgson, Audrey Lee, Clara Ma, Eleanor Newman, Kelvin Parnell Jr., Lauren Van Nest, and Megan Walsh. When you join us at the Kluge-Ruhe for the reception tomorrow night or the program on Saturday morning, you'll see the results of their efforts at the exhibition Beyond Dreamings, the Rise of Indigenous Australian Art in the United States. And that's on display until July 7th, so there's ample time to come back and savor it at a later time. There are many people to acknowledge and thank for contributing both to the Beyond Dreamings exhibition and to the symposium. Lenders to the exhibition include Greg Castillo, who's here with us, John and Barbara Wilkerson, and the Wolfenson Family Foundation. Sponsors at UVA are the Institute for Global Humanities and Cultures, the McIntyre Department of Art, the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs, particularly Deans Ed Barnaby and Philip Trello, and the Vice Provost for the Arts. We're exceedingly grateful to our outside sponsors, the Embassy of Australia and Maningrida Arts and Culture, for their contributions as well. We're particularly indebted to our symposium speakers, Balang John Monjol, OAN, John Mundine, OAN, Chris Anderson, John Carty, Francoise Dussart, Murray Gard, Eleanor Newman, Maya Nuku, Terry Smith, and Peter Sutton, for taking time from their busy lives to share their knowledge and experience with us. Some of these notable people, through their involvement with the Dreamings exhibition, set the foundation for Aboriginal Australian art in the United States, and are, by extension, responsible for the very existence of the Kluge-Ruhe collection. Others are leading academic and curatorial voices for global contemporary Indigenous art today. Several of them advised Henry's students in the curation of Beyond Dreamings, and they have been outstanding colleagues and friends to the Kluge-Ruhe collection in numerous ways over the past 20 years. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Wood, an enrolled member of the Monacan Indian Nation and Director of Virginia Indian Programs at Virginia Humanities. Karen holds an MFA in poetry and a PhD in linguistic anthropology from UVA. She's worked at the National Museum of the American Indian as a researcher and at the Association on American Indian Affairs as a repatriation specialist. In 2015, she was honored as one of Virginia's Women in History. Karen is the Mellon Indigenous Arts Initiative Faculty Fellow and the author of 2 poetry collections, Markings on Earth, which was published in 2000, and Weaving the Boundary, which was published in 2016. So please help me welcome Dr. Karen Wood.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you all for coming out this evening. My role tonight is to welcome you as a member of the Homeland Tribe, the Monacan people, whose existence has been here for thousands of years, and to bring you into our circle of community to say thank you for coming all this way to share what you have, your knowledge with us. And so first, I'd like to offer a prayer. To do that by telling you what I'm going to say in English, and then I'll say it in my language, which is to say, we bring everybody's mind into a good place together, into a kind and healing space. We forget all of the troubles that we have. We leave them outside the door. You can pick them up on your way out if you would like. And in the meantime, I want you to speak to our Creator and say, Igun Ekia, Sawantu Badunikas, Masi Kambi, Tosning Hambe, Ikiwa Wakasi, and then you yes, Monkey Koi, Kanyoksa, Yamabi Toka, Helenes, Kawaya from Spera and outside. Ika Amai, Inyoma, the Pasti Ain, Ika Amai, from Spera Vidaya. And what I'm also doing is acknowledging, in addition to our relationships to one another, our relationships to the beings around us, the geographic formations, the mountains we call our grandmothers. You know, this is our home place, a very special place. And for us, it is not a place to extract resources. It is a place of reciprocity where we come together to give back. So I hope that that's what you'll be able to do during this symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, that was beautiful. So tonight's program is a conversation with curator John Mundine. John is a Bundjalung man born in 1951 in Grafton, New South Wales. OAM, which is at the end of his name, is, OAM is a recognition from the Australian government for his extraordinary achievements. It's the Medal of the Order of Australia, but I recall John used to say it stands for Old Aboriginal Man. John is someone who is kind of an icon in the field of Aboriginal art. He worked as art center manager at Milingimbi beginning in 1979 and went on to be the art center manager at Ramingining for more than a decade. He's best known for working collaboratively with Indigenous artists on many major collections for institutions and for collectors, most notably the Aboriginal Memorial, which many of you have seen in person at the National Gallery of Art in Canberra, a 1988 installation that we'll talk about a little bit later, but also Native Born, a collection of 200 paintings for the Power Institute, and that was put together in 1983, and the Kluge collection beginning in 1989. Tonight, in addition to talking about these accomplishments, we'll learn about some of John's more recent projects, working with communities and descendants on collaborative programs exploring their family and history with and working with groups of artists orchestrating performance artworks. John has always operated on the cutting edge of Indigenous Australian art. He's a prolific writer and carries much of the history of the movement in his very sharp memory. He's a cultural icon in the Aboriginal art world, and we're delighted he's here tonight. Please help me welcome John Mundine. What I didn't say is John and I have known each other since 1996, so almost my whole career working with Aboriginal art. So the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to ask him some questions, and then he's going to talk, and we'll try and steer it in a direction that roughly matches the slides. But may or may not happen that way.
I won't be about my war injuries.
Okay, so this first slide shows John in 1980 up in Arnhem Land. And I wanted to first ask, what was the state of Aboriginal art in Australia when you first started working in remote communities, in remote community art centers?
Well, thank you. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks to Karen Woods for that welcome to country. That was really great. That's one of the first times I've had that from a Native American person. So that's really good that that was organised. Thank you. The state, all these photos, as you get older, people pull these photos out. Some people keep trying to blackmail you or something. When I came to work in the field of Aboriginal art formally, because I was involved in Aboriginal art and cultural practice or cultural thinking from the day I was born, in fact. So Bunjalung people, I was born into a family, the Bunjalung people of northern New South Wales, a very large group, very well recorded, that our language is written down in English and taught at the university there for quite some time. It's a very well-known Aboriginal group. So when I actually came to work in Aboriginal art, in a commercial sense, or in an academic sense, like all of you are here for, I gather, that about the mid-70s, the government at that time had set up a company to market Aboriginal art, so that it wasn't being sold as tourist art for sixpence or whatever it is, for a dime or a nickel. It was sold to bring it into the Australian art, fine art world, and then by that into the world of fine art creation that were worldwide. And that was their brief to do that. And I came there, and it was like one of those comedy things where somebody gave me a hat and a desk and a sign that said, we'll make you our operations manager. And so like that, like someone from the Wizard of Oz giving me, we'll put a medal on you or a name. And of course, what it meant was I was the storeman and packer. So I used to pack it with all the artwork up and wrap it up and make sure it was taken away by truck or plane or whatever. And that's really how I came to work there. Now the position I took up, just quickly, the position I took up in Milingimbi, it's called an art and craft advisor in those days. And that position was normally held on these Christian missions, which largely these communities were Christian missions, that they, one of the missionaries on that mission would actually market the art, paintings and so on that were made by the Aboriginal people. Those churches would be given an amount of money to feed, so to speak, to feed all the people that were on their mission, or go towards feeding the people that were on their mission and looking after them. Any other money they could raise, any artist or local Aboriginal person who could paint or weave a mat or a basket, etc., that would be extra money that they could then buy things from the store of that mission. And so this particular peculiar painting, photo, somebody sent me from, who was at Milingimbi in 1980, 81, David Ritchie actually, the head of the Sacred Sites Authority in Darwin now. His wife was a teacher there. But we received a funny letter from a French naval museum in La Havre, so excuse my French, and they wanted to buy a bark canoe. And so we talked to a number of people, but the people on Cape Stewart near us, they went about it and made this bark canoe. And we picked that up from Cape Stewart, which was to the west of Milingimbi. Milingimbi is an island in a number of islands that are still known, called the Crocodile Islands, because, as you know, the whole place is full of crocodiles. We went over there to pick that up and bring it back, and it had never actually been put in the water, so we brought it back and put it in the water there just to test it before we sent it off to this in this weird way to France. But anyway, these positions, when in the 70s, the Whitlam government began a program called self-determination. And what happened was that local councils were set up within these Aboriginal villages and societies to run the mission rather than the missionaries running it. And that was a big step. And when they did that, they formalised the position in the early 70s of being an art and craft advisor. It became a paid position then, instead of a missionary just doing this in their spare time, so to speak.
And so from Milingimbi you went to Ramangini, and this is the first arts and crafts building at Ramangini in the slide.
Yes, that's right, luxurious.
And so you have written about different phases in Aboriginal art, kind of different periods. And just now you've talked about a couple when missionaries were kind of intermediaries between artists and the public that was buying the artworks, and then the arts and crafts company that was started by the government. But when you started working in Ramangini, there was, some of the things that you managed to do really kind of brought Aboriginal art into more of a national spotlight through programs like Perspective. And so I was just curious about, do you want to go through those 6 phases very briefly?
Well, the 6 phases, somewhere I wrote down, but other people have said this before and published this somewhere else too, that I said there were 6. It's a personal view of the 6 phases in the history of Aboriginal art. And it's basically how the Australian population, the non-Aboriginal Australian population, reacted to Aboriginal art and Aboriginal people. So you have in fact, when the British arrived in Australia, there were at least about 250 different language groups across the country. There were 250 different societies living in different geographical environments across the country and carrying on a cultural practice, an art practice as well that was different. So I came to the thing to draw up my 6 phases of Aboriginal art, and they were the first phases from the beginning of time when Aboriginal people were on the continent of Australia. That's the creation of the world, so to speak, which is something 60, 70,000 years before the present, up until about the end of the Second World War. And after that, there were collections being put together before that. There were collections being put together by various ethnographers, anthropologists. I don't have to split hairs on defining the differences between those people. But I think the Museum of Victoria had a collection of Aboriginal artworks. The South Australian Museum, of course, had a collection of Aboriginal art and artefacts, and the same in Sydney and Brisbane. So that's the first phase, though. It wasn't seen, the Aboriginal objects and creations weren't really seen as art. And although people collected those paintings and other objects, sculpture works, etc., they struggled to define them as art with a capital A. And so up until the time after the Second World War, those collections were largely in ethnographic museums. In the 1950s, 2 things happened. The anthropologist couple, Ronald and Catherine Byrne, put on an exhibition of bark paintings from Arnhem where they named Aboriginal people individually for the first time. They named, it sounds peculiar, but it wasn't an unknown Aboriginal. They were named Aboriginal people. They were named by their European name, they were named by their Aboriginal name, and they were named by their language name as well. And so they were divided into geographical styles, and so they tried to divide and really seriously look at the paintings that were being done. The other thing that happened in the late 50s is the Art Gallery of New South Wales started to commission and collect tiwi poles, burial poles, from Bathurst, Melville Island really. These burial poles that were put into the collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Now that created a real stir at the time. There was a long discussion about, is this the right place? Is this really art, or is this just primitive art, or is it ethnography, not really art? And so that discussion went around again about what is it? This is art, is it not art, is it, or even if it is art, is it minimalist art, is it abstract art, and so on. And that discussion went around for a little while, and then it all dissipated, and the material though stayed in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So Aboriginal art came to be shown in at that time, the major art gallery in Australia as art, albeit it was called in the Primitive Art Gallery. A collection of New Guinea work work from New Guinea that was also placed in that room. So that's the second phase, is that recognition of Aboriginal artists as individuals. And a woman was actually in that burnt collection exhibition. There was a female painter in that collection. So that's a very big step in that. The third phase, that all that art remained there, and when the director who initiated that, the deputy director who initiated that left, it was there, no one wrote particularly about it, the discussion died down again, and it was just there, it remained there. The third phase is the 1970s phase of Western Desert, painters from the Western Desert taking designs of ground installation art that they did on the ground and on their bodies, and they started to paint those images as compositions onto canvas using acrylic paint. And that's from the 1970s, early 1970s on. That debate then went around again. Is this real art? Is it tourist art? Is it just, cerebral art? Is it something from abstract thought? Is it just designs, patterns, or whatever? And that went around for quite a long time, but by this stage, the Australian art world had moved on quite a bit in its appreciation of different styles of art. At that stage, in the Australian art world, the biggest argument that was going on, that came to physical punches. People would actually get really drunk at openings and have big punch-ups over whether this painting, whether they were, what was the correct art, and the style of painting was whether it was abstract or whether it was figurative. And that was the hugest argument. That's the biggest argument that was going on in the white art world. Something really important, in the world. As against all the other things that were happening in post-colonial things that were happening in Africa. There were wars going on. There's a war going on in China, and so on. Millions of people were being killed here and there all over the world. But the most important thing was, we don't want to paint that or photograph it. We want to argue about whether I'm a figurative painter or I'm an abstract painter. They were the most important, the ego things. So that's the third phase. The fourth phase is into the 80s, when post-colonial writing and ideas start to come to Australia in a very evident way. Because by the 80s, in 1978, Edward Said had written his Orientalist publication, Orientalism, and by the early 1980s, Omi Barber had written about hybridity and so on, how we're all a hybrid, really. So, and a number of exhibitions took place that recognised the Aboriginal people that weren't living in traditional communities, weren't practising traditional religion, and weren't even speaking their own language in that sense. These people had been to Western art schools. They then used Western art styles, Western art materials, to state their Aboriginality, their position of their heritage, their legacy of being of Aboriginal descent. So that was in the 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, these people then began to form their own artist cooperatives, the Mali Aboriginal Artist Cooperative, to sell their work, because they couldn't get into commercial galleries. Commercial galleries didn't take them up as the latest movement of Aboriginal art, so they set up their own arts cooperative and began to curate, market and write about themselves in the early 80s. By the fifth phase in Aboriginal art is after that. When they formed that cooperative, they began to curate their own shows and write about themselves, albeit in a very minor way. But they then began to write and control their representation as much as they could. So that is the fifth phase. And we're now in what's called the sixth phase. About there are Aboriginal artists curating and writing about ourselves, but there's a counter movement to again bring us back into the primitive, so to speak, into this reduced thing. Sorry, go on.
Well, so, I mean, that's actually helpful to lay out your vision of these stages, because some of the things that we'll be talking about are, part of each of those things. And I just want to go on and show you the next slide of Bula Bula, because you did end up building a proper art center. And in fact, this is a picture with me and Ann Booker in it, in front of Bula Bula Arts. She's here tonight. But this picture was taken in 1983 of you with Wanjuk Marika, and you were down in Sydney at Australia Council, and we happened to look back through the Kluge-Ruhe archives, and we found an article that really speaks to what you were talking about, because it was kind of one of those cusp moments between these two phases, where there was an exhibition at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, newly installed, and the person who wrote the article said that previously the bark paintings had been nailed to the walls and left there for 10 years. And so that was the New Guinea and Aboriginal art that was kind of considered the primitive art. And this exhibition in 1983 was a new installation that was really returning to that idea that Tony Tuxson had of looking at the art as fine art. So I was just wondering if you wanted to reflect on that a little bit.
Well, there's a period where I'd taken a break. I was very driven, so I didn't actually. I used to stay there the whole year as much as I could in those places.
Ramangini.
And another place, Ramangini and Ramangini. But this time I took a break, and I actually was staying with someone, and they said, "Oh, you should go and see the primitive art gallery at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and go and see that exhibition." And so I did. And I just asked at the door, who is the Aboriginal art curator here, or who's looking after this collection? And they said this woman who was actually in charge of European, 18th century European art, she was actually in charge of that. But she took that up because she was trying to maintain or keep up Tony Tuxson, the deputy director who collected all this art, trying to keep his legacy alive and keep the Aboriginal art in the public domain and in the public eye. She came down and talked to me, and she said, "We've been trying to put on an exhibition of these barks from Millingundi, Maningrida and Ramangini and so on." I said, "Well, I actually lived there." And so between us, we talked. I had to go back to Ramangini, but we conversed, and in the end there was an exhibition of these 200 bark paintings, of 200 of the 300 odd bark paintings that were brought out, and this huge exhibition that was put on at that time. Now, the person behind me is a man called Wanjuk Marika from Yirrkala, and it's a curious thing about, as I was saying, about this argument that was going on in the contemporary art world about whether I was an abstractionist and I wasn't smiling. He called me an abstractionist and I wasn't smiling. That kind of thing, or whether I was a figurative painter. The people of Yirrkala had encountered a mining company coming to their area to mine, who'd reached an agreement with the Australian government to mine bauxite in their area. And in that process, really, the Aboriginal people of that area, we heard Karen Wood give this talk here, and I was explaining to John Marshall that she is the landowner here. This is we would say, you're the Wanga, you're the landowner for this place. And these people in the Yirrkala Peninsula, the Go Peninsula, were at a reached agreement without actually talking to the local Aboriginal people. And they reacted by petitioning Parliament. You can make a petition to Parliament, and they typed a statement in 2 pages, and these were pasted on the back of 3 small bark paintings that were sent off to Parliament and to the National Parliament to say, look, we've lived here, we've always lived here, we own this land, or this land owns us. Anything that's done here should be discussed with us before you do this mining. And the government at the time looked at it, and they sort of cried crocodile tears and gasped and were profoundly moved by this presentation, but basically didn't do anything. They certainly weren't about to acknowledge that the Aboriginal people owned this land. So they set up a commission of inquiry, and that commission of inquiry essentially said that Aboriginal people didn't really own this land. If anything, the land owned them, which is a nice sort of semantic twist by some parliamentarian who was a poet. So that commission was an impossible statement, an impossible thing for the government to stand on that. So they had another commission that came forward, and as a result of that, these people were given a form of native land rights to that land. And the mining company then reached a form of contractual agreement that they would pay them money for mining on this land. Aboriginal people would have control over the direction of that mining, that their particularly sacred sites would be respected, etc., to a certain degree. All that is pragmatically, given the power inequality, that was a really big, important movement, and people used these art pieces, these 3 bark paintings, as that statement. And Australians generally wouldn't think that they have great art pieces that say things, or in that time. They wouldn't have said, we don't have a Guernica, or we don't have any of these great political statement paintings. In fact, well, they did, these 3 paintings, that then forced a change in legislation that gave Aboriginal people certain rights. This was made into a film by Werner Herzog, this struggle called Where Green Ants Dream, which is about this struggle, and the Wandjut Marika, actually in it,
well,
and Roy Marika.
Well, that's a great lead into the next slide, which is the Aboriginal Memorial. Because, again, the Yirrkala Bark Petition, 1963, really kicked off that very public land rights struggle, and 1988, which was Australia's bicentennial, or the bicentennial of the arrival, permanent settlement by the British in Australia. Many Aboriginal people felt, what's there to celebrate? And so this was the response that came out of Brahma Guinea, with you very much organizing and conceiving of it and implementing it. So can you describe what the Aboriginal Memorial is and how that happened?
Well, it came out and sort of tied into the story of the Dreamings in another way. In 1988, as it came up, that was the 200 years of the coming of the British to colonise Australia. and attempt to exterminate Aboriginal people. It's sort of like what happened in the United States, I gather, with your 200 years of Columbus coming here, and a similar debate was taking place about, well, was it really a great benefit that Columbus had came here? Was it really that important? Was it that important the British had come to Aboriginal Australia? So yeah, actually, by the 1980s, Aboriginal art was appearing in major Australian institutions as a form of contemporary art, of the part of the art life of Australia by the 1980s. So Aboriginal art had appeared in the Sydney Biennale at least 3-4 times by 1988. It also appeared in some international exhibitions, albeit small exhibitions, to Southeast Asian countries and so on. An Aboriginal art exhibition had been to China by that stage too. So as it approached in Aboriginal circles, it was debated about whether the coming of the British was anything to celebrate, and of course we agreed that it wasn't. But how do you deal with this event that's going to take place, that's been sponsored by the Australian government to enormous amounts of money? They were building new buildings, they were building new roads. Every new road was called the Bicentenary Highway. Every new building was the Bicentenary this or that. And there was going to be a Biennale of Sydney in 1988 called Under the Southern Sky, it was going to be called. And all these artists were making 200 of this, 200 of that, 200. They were making portraits of 200 famous women, 200 famous colonial bakers, whatever, 200 meat pies, and so on. Literally, some of the 200 went to that length of absurdity. And we had an Australian who was having his 200th schooner of beer, a Prime Minister, who was very famous for drinking, and yeah, he was most probably going to have his 200th schooner of beer. So that was what was going on. So we decided, I went to a number of meetings in Sydney. I lived in Remington, but I was going back and forth to put on commercial exhibitions in Sydney and Melbourne and other places. And I went to a number of meetings of Aboriginal people in Sydney about what we were going to do. How could we make an impact that would draw attention to everything? The director of the Biennale I was told to go and meet him, and I went and met him, and I had this idea of a forest of burial poles for many years. And this is way to display these poles was to show them like in a forest, to put up two forms of curating, of presenting things. You either put up a critical mass, some things operate more effectively as a critical mass, a number of objects rather than just one, or the opposite of that is the solitary iconic object, where the object is this one object that's put up with extreme reverence as almost like a holy object, the iconic object, or this critical mass approach. And with the critical mass approach is to find out, well, what numbers will make this critical mass. And of course, with the bicentenary, it was 200 years, 200 burial poles. And he took to it straight away as an idea. And the idea is that the British coming, and other people, but the British mainly, coming to Australia was 200 years of dispossession, disempowerment, disbursement, and basically murder and an attempt at annihilation on a large scale. And the scale of that annihilation attempt every year is becoming more and more apparent as more and more research is done about how many people were really killed. And the latest figure is that there was, in Queensland alone, there was 60,000 Aboriginal people killed since the coming of the British. That was more than all the Australian casualties in the First World War. Now that was in Queensland, the state of Queensland alone. So there are 6 states in Australia. So that if you multiply that by 6, that's 300,000 at least, and I would say it's much bigger than that. So this statement, I decided people were boycotting having anything to do with the Biennale of Sydney, to do with the bicentenary. And I decided that absence would not be noticed if we weren't going to be in any of the things to do with the bicentenary celebrations, that some people wouldn't even notice it. Most people, I thought, just would not even notice it. They would say, oh, the Aborigines, no one's going to go. Like, oh, we're the Aborigines. Really, they're going to have these grand balls and these grand feasts, dance parties, and basically that's literally what the celebration of the coming of the British ended up. There was no specific legislation that gave certain dispossessed or disadvantaged people more power. They didn't increase any of the rights of women, particularly. They didn't give more money to the poor. We didn't fix up the health system or hospitals or anything particularly. It was just basically an endless period of parties and parties and parties. And my memory is that that's when we started to drink champagne, more so than beer. Instead of shouting 6 beers, we'd get a bottle of Moet Chandon. Instead, we discovered what champagne was. Go on.
Just want to point out, because I've moved on to the slide of the installation at the National Gallery, what the early installation. So this was acquired after the Biennale by the National Gallery, and on permanent exhibition there for more or less.
Curating is all curating, and all art really is about a conversation. And don't worry, I'll shut up in a minute, but you'll get a break. Not you, but I'm just hoping for these people go to sleep. All art, I think all art and all forms is a conversation. It's to stimulate conversation. It's to stimulate people to come together and talk to each other. And the thing about Aboriginal society is the greatest art that we create is the art of living together. That is the greatest art you can ever create or carry or practice. So you think of Aboriginal people living in Australia for 70,000 years. We didn't build skyscrapers, we didn't have a massive Mustang to drive, or whatever, we weren't drinking Moet Chandon. But why we existed on that planet, on that continent, without anything, any of those accoutrements of Europe or China or whatever, that we learned how to survive with each other. We had social practices that allowed us to exist together, to settle disputes, and to actually enjoy life, to create life. And part of that was the art creation came into being, creation of art came into being through a group of related people coming together to create art in all forms, singing, dancing, painting, etc., across all art forms, across all ages and genders, would all come together to create an art event, an art practice. It's a practice of creating art. Now, the reason of that coming together, the point of all that creation of art, which was very ephemeral and would be destroyed in the process of the the performance that took place, it would only exist in the memories of people, memories of those songs. The real reason why you came together was to affirm your relationships to each other, to affirm the relationships to each other, to reaffirm your relationships and responsibilities to the society you lived in, to reaffirm and reinforce the relationships and responsibilities you had to the environment, the land and the environment, and to reinforce and reaffirm your responsibilities to the spiritual cosmos. And that's what that art, that's how real art, I think, is made. And so all these artworks we're just looking at, especially the Aboriginal Memorial, which John Marshall has a number of poles in, is it's about a group of people coming together around an idea to reaffirm their relationships to each other and to the society they live in, the Australian society they live in, and to make this political statement about this is what the coming of the British to Australia in effect meant. Now, in fact, there were a smaller number of Aboriginal memorials across the continent, here and there, not many that existed, but I collaborated with these artists. I had this idea, I took it to these artists, I had endless conversations and discussions about why we were making this thing. I would say a lot of these people still didn't understand completely. There is a belief, though, that in Arnhem there was a false belief that people there existed and were able to exist without a fight, without being threatened with being killed. Now, in fact, near Remengini, there was a cattle war. The people had come there to set up a cattle station, a ranch that you might call, and Aboriginal people were killing the cattle and stealing wire and other things. And the person who was setting up that cattle ranch, they got together a group of men, all the workers, and they rode around and attempted a number of times to exterminate all the Aboriginal people in that area. There's a number of clan groups that exist in Remengini today that only exist as one family, and a lot of that is to do with they copped the brunt of that attack, that attempt to annihilate all the Aboriginal people in that area so that the cattle could roam free, as you've seen in Oklahoma or whatever, you know. But so that became, I collaborated with these people, the artists. I also collaborated with Wally Caruana at the Art National Gallery and James Mollison, the director. We took this to James Mollison to say, look, this is what we'd like to do. I would like to do this for the bicentenary. And he said that, well, this is incredible, I will support this, I will give you the money to create this. In fact, he said that he tried to say, look, I'll give you half the money before you leave the building today, which is someone who wanted this to happen and wanted action to make it happen. So it was commissioned by them, they would then own it, but he agreed that the gallery would have this on permanent display when it got there.
And it's been in different places in the National Gallery, and
It's been to Switzerland too, it's been to Germany and to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg.
Really only traveled that one time on
Yes.
an extended tour, but then they built this purpose-built space for it, and just recently celebrated the 30th anniversary as well.
Yes, that's right.
So at the same time as the Aboriginal Aboriginal Memorial, the 1988, the bicentennial year, that was the year of the Dreamings exhibition. So since this is our organizing, idea for the symposium, wanted to just talk about your role with the Dreamings exhibition.
Well, in this case of there were two exhibitions that were attempted to come together in this way. Because taking Aboriginal art, if supporters of Aboriginal art within Australia, lovers of Aboriginal art, wanted to take these things overseas, for a number of reasons. One was just the beauty of the art and the aesthetics. If you love that art, you would want the world to see it and understand it. The other reason was the political statement of bringing Aboriginal people into the light, so they would then be more certain people would be more politically responsible towards Aboriginal people. So I knew Peter Sutton, who's over there, who's with us today, and Chris Anderson, who's with us today, for quite well, in fact, through a number of other exhibitions that were carried out in Adelaide. But they'd also really worked with art exhibitions and studies. They created lots of exhibitions that were about particular Aboriginal art practices to bring that into the light, to make this thing, to this ingenuity and intelligence and imagination that Aboriginal people displayed in these creations into the light. So rather than people seeing Aboriginal people as Stone Age people or unintelligent and in this really racist way, that they've published a number of exhibitions and catalogues before this time, or just about this time. The 1980s was a very fertile time for all forms of Aboriginal creativity, and certainly the South Australian Museum. So they put up this proposal through a way that they'll explain tomorrow, I think, about how it actually happened, this proposal to take an exhibition to New York, to the Asia Society Gallery. And they put together a selection of work, and Remen Ginning was very fortunate in having a couple of senior Aboriginal artists in that selection of work. Peter Sutton arrived one day with Andrew Pekarik, who was the curator of the Asia Society Gallery, to meet the Aboriginal artist and have this conversation and make the invitation, etc., etc. So that discussion took place with every other artist in the work. They were very diligent in talking to the artists they wanted to put in the show and how it was going to be displayed, the reason behind these particular works. So it's a very intense conversation that took place with the Aboriginal artists in these remote areas. And then, as it turned out, they then wanted the artists to come to the exhibition opening. There are three rules. I had three rules to do with curating Aboriginal art. And one is that you have to bring the artist to the exhibition. You'll see lots of exhibitions, in fact, where the artist isn't present. And I think curators have always got to remember that they aren't the star. They didn't make the art. This other poor bugger did, called an artist, the starving artist. We were pretty cool then. So that's one thing, to bring the artist. The second rule is that you have to pay the artist a fee for using their work in the exhibition. And the third thing is that you have to publish a catalogue that remains behind after the exhibition comes down. And this is what this group, the group of largely anthropologists at the South Australian Museum, they were putting this together, and they created a really magnificent catalogue. They brought the artist, arranged to find a sponsor so that they could bring us to New York. Dolly Grenitz and these other people from Damu also came, and we were paid to come. And there's another story there which I won't bore you with, not about the payment, but we were given a check, a reserve, what we call the reserve bank check, and before we went to go back, we were looked after and paid money to eat, drink, and be merry, etc., smoke, and buy clothes, etc. And then when we were finished with the exhibition opened, this really grand opening, lots of people came to it, including John Kluge, who saw the show here. And that's why we're here now. He then became enamored with Aboriginal art and wanted to start to collect it. He said, oh, this is the art practice of the time to collect this. But when we were then given our checks, all right, this is your pay, and we went back. We arrived back in Sydney, and it's a Reserve Bank check. So there is a Reserve Bank in the middle of Sydney. And so we went to the Reserve Bank and said, can we cash this check? This is us, and we all had passports, so we were able to show this is us, this is who we are. And the guy behind the counter kept saying, we don't know who you are. And we're saying, well, this is our passport, this is us. Like, see the photo? Look, this is us. Yeah. And they said, oh, but you could have stolen those. And I said, yeah, that's right. We could have steamed the photo off and went through that, you know, like that. We're like Russian spies. We could falsify these passports and whatever. And then I said, well, it's got the signature. And they said, that mightn't be the Reserve Bank signature. And it went on like that until I could have punched these people. So we then left that place, and I went to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where people knew me and said, look, we're having this trouble. And they said, look, just give us a minute, you sit down and we'll get some tea and coffee and biscuits and cakes, and they brought out this feast for us. And then he said, look, go down to our bank, I told them who you are, just show them who you are, and they'll give you the money in cash. And that resolved that thing. And that wasn't particularly the museum's problem. You would think that people would have been a bit more open to actually paying their own checks. So this is us buying clothes. This is
Talking at the symposium.
yes, talking at the symposium. It really wasn't, we were really embarrassed because it's the first time we'd been to the United States. We'd come across the Pacific. We really suffered from jet lag and struggled to get through this talking thing that we were supposed to be there and be happy and really full of knowledge and whatever, and quoting algorithms and whatever, and family charts, so that we really struggled with this. And one day I think we should make a film. I want to make a short film about this trip, because it turned out in the end there was Chris and Peter and Fred Myers and Francois Dessart, and there was myself. I was the art advisor, and the art advisor from Damu was there. And so there was an anthropologist. There's that joke about an Aboriginal family. There's a man, a woman, and a child, and an anthropologist. And now in the 80s, the joke is, of course, the modern Aboriginal family is a man, woman, and child, and a photographer. But that was what it was like. Every artist virtually had their own anthropologist. But the beauty of that was that these anthropologists and myself, we could actually converse in language with each artist. So there were 5 languages or something being spoken. So it was just this. The scene was so funny. Like we just say, "All right, we're going to go for breakfast, and where do you want to go?" And so everyone had to speak. There'd be 5 conversations going on. What do you want to eat, sort of thing. And of course, these people from Ravengilling will say, "Well, we don't know. We've never been to New York before. We don't even know what food there is here. We don't know what food is." But this intense conversations would suddenly take place. It was just like a Monty Python sketch. But it was a great time to be there. It made the press everywhere. People like Thomas Keneally wrote an article, a huge article for it, and other people wrote articles and reported on it. Serious art writers started to take it up. The John Webber Gallery started to sell the Western Desert paintings, and John Kluge started this collection.
He did, in fact. Okay, so this is just a funny photo, but I love it because John's carrying a rifle there, and he has a story about John Kluge coming to Ravengilling. So John Kluge had a home in New York, and he went to the Dreamings exhibition, and really, within about a month, he flew over to Australia on his private jet and flew to Ravengilling. So he arrived in Ravengilling.
Well, he actually went to a number of other places too.
Yes, but when he arrived in Ravengilling to meet with you,
Yes.
Can you just describe?
Well, the thing was, he was coming. We were trying to work out who this person was, and we don't normally meet billionaires. That was the first person I met that was a billionaire, because it's like 50 cents nowadays. But people talk about billions all the time. But it's the first time I heard someone described as a billionaire. And in his talk, I met Maurice Tuckman, who was his curatorial advisor at that stage. And I remember he asked me in New York, "Do you think you'll need a bodyguard?" When he said, "Well, you need a bodyguard." And I thought, bodyguard? This village of about 300 people, like we hardly wore clothes or anything, I don't know what he was frightened of. And it just said, "No, you want a bodyguard?" But then they were coming on a certain day, so I cleaned the house, I scrubbed the toilet bowl, did all these things, washed up, cleaned the house, and cleaned the car, my truck. And I took everything out of the truck and hosed it down, scrubbed it down, so it was shiny and new. And I was putting everything back into the car, and they'd arrived early. And some teacher had went out and picked them up from the airport. They flew in, and they just arrived suddenly. And as I was putting the jack and the spare tire and that back into the truck, and I had this, they were looking at me because I was, I was sort of half undressed or wearing no shirt and whatever. And they were giving me this really funny look and they got off the truck really cautiously, he and his wife, and they were looking at me, and then I realised I was carrying the shotgun. But things went on really well after that. And so I looked like some sort of hillbilly or something. But then things went on really well because the people there, Ravengilling is a place where children would just come up and say, "Well, who are you and what's your name?" And they, without offence, they're just saying, "Oh yeah, I'm so and so. What's your name?" And I remember one period where John Kluge was walking through the street, and all these kids were coming up and saying, "Well, what's your name? What's your name?" And he was telling them, having this conversation, and that's the kind of community it was. You could just wander around, and he didn't need a bodyguard, obviously. But he came there, and he came at a bad time. In that it was a very busy year, and I just come back from somewhere else for another exhibition, and there wasn't absolutely nothing in the arts centre. And these Maurice Tuckman and Mike O'Farrell was this Australian curator. They were running around trying to say, look at this, yeah, it's not a waste of time. You know, it's not a waste of time. And then I looked over, and we lived in, we operated out of that shipping container, and we had to have a rock to step up into it. And we used to have flower drums, these drums, metal 5-gallon drums, and we put a cushion on it, and that was our seats, because we were operating at a very high level. It's a very sophisticated place. But I remember looking over, and John Kluge was sitting on this flower drum, and sort of just really bored, basically. And he looked, he said, well, what do you reckon, John? And then I said, look, well, I had this proposal to give a collection of paintings, a commissioned collection of paintings to New Parliament House. In 1988, the Australian government had built this incredible new Parliament House. It's that Parliament House we use today. And they were looking for art objects to go into that. And I'd put this proposal forward to them that in Remington, in that part of the world, there was a binary, the society existed in this binary form. There was this half, they call it the moiety system. Moiety is a French word. What does that mean?
Half.
Thank you. How do you pronounce it? Moiety, yes. So they existed in other parts of the country, in the southeast as well. People existed in this thing that was like a yin and yang. Everyone knows about yin and yang, but they don't understand that Aboriginal societies, in large part, operate on this binary system. And the Parliament House exists on a binary system. There are 2 houses of Parliament. You have 2 houses of Parliament here, don't you? Congress, or 3 or 4 or something like that. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. You just chuck that out the window when you want. So anyway, they had 2 houses of Parliament. It's called a bicameral system of parliamentary democracy. And so these 2 houses have to agree, or they just debate things. And in Australia, there's a 2-party system. Like you have your major parties here. There are 100 other minor political parties, but you have the Republicans and the Democrats. In Australia, they're the Liberal Country Party and the Labor Party. And the debate that they have in Parliament brings laws together and creates the life that we have to live, that we live under. And so the idea was to put a collection of these 2 halves of paintings. One would be Dua. This Dua is one half, the yin part, so to speak, the sunrise people. And the other half, Yirritja paintings and objects. All these Dua paintings and objects would be put in the government offices, and all these other ones would be put in the opposition offices. Now they didn't, they ran out of money, the Parliament Committee ran out of money, and so that didn't happen. So, but when John Kluge said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, look, there's a commission. You could have this commission. It's not going to go into Parliament, but it can go into, well, you could have that. And anyway, I was really interested, and he said, and I said, but it costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he looked at his wife and he said, oh no, we'd love one of those. And we'll have one of those. And that was how it went.
And I think that you've told me, and maybe you've written this as well, that there's also a little bit of natural competition that exists between the moieties. And people, when they brought in their artworks into the art center and displayed them, like this work by Andrew Margalit, other people would see that and they'd think, oh, I can do my biggest, best painting and bring that one in. And so the quality of the paintings that were produced for this commission were really quite extraordinary. And
yes, I think it's the thing about general patronage of anything. All great artists in history have had a patron, any music or anything, paintings or whatever you can think of, or plays or whatever, they've been under a patronage of somebody. When artists believe that they can do anything and work to any scale, they will. If they know that they will be commiserated, they'll be recompensed financially, and they can just practice and expect to have a living. And so that's what this commission did. So these artists, when they made larger paintings, they'd made larger paintings before, but they really made these beautiful paintings. This painting by Mickey Durham is really a body painting for a particular ceremony, but this is the first time I've ever seen this on a flat surface, like a flat painting surface. And that happened as a result of this commission.
so different innovations and different expressions came out of that. I want to move on just a little bit because we're getting close to time. And this is also just a picture of us all working at Morven, John Kluge's property, on the catalog that came out of his collection, Art from the Land. And John, speaking at the symposium we had in 1997, shortly before the collection was given to UVA. And then we have talked just about a couple of other exhibitions that have been abroad from Australia. Native porn was shown in Australia, but then also came back to the Asia Society Gallery much later. And Arajara was another one. And I just wondered if you wanted to share a couple of thoughts very briefly about the difference between Dreamings and Arajara, or
Well, a number of, as the bicentenary came up, as I said, there were people who were supporters of Aboriginal art. There were a number of people who thought they should put large exhibitions together for that bicentenary and tour them overseas. The South Australian Museum and that team of people got their act together much quicker and more, and I think they were more focused on what they were actually doing in one way. Two Aboriginal people were in charge of the Aboriginal Arts Board. Gary Foley was the director, political activist, they both were, and Charles Chicka Dixon was the chairman. Now they made a sort of a very strong statement in the lead up to 1988. They basically told the Australia Council that their Aboriginal Arts Board would not fund any bicentenary projects. And they said our strategy is to take Aboriginal art overseas, to put exhibitions together and take it overseas. Because they were taken out and shot the next day, of course. But, so to speak, they were sacked, and that revolt of sorts didn't go anywhere. But they involved a Swiss-German artist called Bernhard Ludwig, who was in Australia at the time, and he went back to Germany which is where he lived. He went back to Germany to take this message and try to find people who would be interested in taking an Aboriginal art exhibition overseas to speak about our side of the history of the British coming to Australia. They couldn't get anything to happen in 89 or 88, 89, but in 1989 there was another bicentenary exhibition happened called The Magicians of the Earth at the Pompidou Centre. Now that exhibition had a lot of Aboriginal artists in it. In fact, John Knowles, I think, was in that too, I think. Yeah, in the Magicians of the Earth. And so was the two men, Jimmy Woolaloo from the Dreamings exhibition was also in that Magicians of the Earth exhibition. So Bernard Luthi organised to take a group of artists from Yurandamu, and they installed a sand painting, as it's called, as part of the Magicians of the Earth exhibition. While he was there, he met a lot of other art curators of like mind who said, we would love to have an Aboriginal art exhibition. So he went back to Dusseldorf and they negotiated with a number of other curators in institutions in Europe. And eventually, though, the crux of it, the real story, was he went to school with there was a guy he went to school with who now worked in a German bank in Dusseldorf. And they had lunch one day and that man said, we will fund Arajara to happen. And they virtually gave nearly 2 million Deutschmarks, which was quite a large sum of money in those days. The Deutschmark was a really solid currency. And he supported to the tune of, I think it's 1.8 million Deutschmarks they put up. They were able to convince the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen in Dusseldorf, the art collection in Dusseldorf, to take the exhibition. They convinced the Hayward Gallery in London to take the exhibition, and they convinced the Louisiana Museum in Denmark to take the exhibition. Now those three are very contemporary art spaces. I know we won't get into debating about contemporary and modern and what other things.
We can say that
So for tomorrow. But they're very contemporary art spaces. They were only built in the 1960s, and they were very cutting edge. Like Joseph Beuys used to teach in Dusseldorf at the art school. Penn, that German figurative painter, he used to teach at the art school. And the Hayward Gallery, of course, was the place of contemporary art in London. And the Humlebeck, the Louisiana Museum, is, I think, the greatest contemporary art space I've ever been in, really, as an art museum. So they were all very contemporary art places. So we were able to score that, and that money then allowed that to happen. Now, by a thing of fate, or bad luck, or a curse, I was also involved in giving advice. My advice was more almost companionship to these people at the South Australian Museum, who knew what they were doing, and that they were operating at a level commiserate with what I would do, but they did all that themselves. With Arajara, I also gave support to that. Now there's a point that's written somewhere, I read it the other day, that the Dreamings exhibition had this incredible range of art, and from historical objects through to really contemporary produced art pieces, and people also created a ground painting in there as part of that. But it didn't include this group of people, the Bamali group. They, as I was saying, that fourth phase of Aboriginal art, when people in urban settings started to make art, and they came together to form this cooperative called Bamali Aboriginal Artists, because to curate their own shows in their own space, so they didn't have to depend on it, trying to convince institutions you have to take this or that. They could just do this themselves. And they were the backbone of people starting to write about themselves and curate their own exhibitions. So, but because they only came into being in 1987, they missed being in the 1988 Biennale of Sydney, they hadn't had their act together to get into that. They also missed being in the French magicians of the earth. They could have easily fitted into that, and they missed into the dreaming. The reason why they were in Arajara is that took place, 5 years after 1988. 1994 was when Arajara started, but they were able to get in on the Aboriginal advisory panel that was going to drive Arajara, and that's really how they got into Arajara. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got into Arajara either.
So we only have a couple more minutes, and there's one project that you've done that I really would like you to talk about, but I did want to slide this image in just because this is taken by Michael Riley, one of the members of Umali, and that's a famous image of John. But this is the project that I'd like you to talk about, and we'll just wrap up with this because I love this project. We discussed it at length. And this is something that you did with a community, really a group of descendants of the people in this photograph. And what you see on the right is a painting that was made. So could you just describe a little bit of that and kind of your art practice, which is kind of a combination of curatorial and art practice, working with groups of people?
Well, I do think that as a curator, there's their names will come to me. There's two Swiss curators who redefined what a curator was. Once upon a time, there were curators who organised artists, and there were artists who made art, and then there were curators who organised artists into exhibitions, etc. But these people saw themselves as curators, but they saw themselves as being like the fifth artist, the additional artist to make that exhibition, to make that project happen. Now again, I fell into this by accident. I can draw and I can read and write and do those things. And I can draw really well, in fact, but I don't call myself an artist. As I say in my 4A statement is, I don't call myself an artist, and I don't call myself an anthropologist, I don't call myself an academic, but I am an Aboriginal person, and therefore I know something, at least, of note. So this place came out of a project. I used to use this photo on the left to show people that in colonial times, before Aboriginal people got the vote, before Aboriginal people had the power to own property, before the land rights was recognised, before Aboriginal people were really recognised, we didn't just sit around drinking and taking drugs and being mentally depressive. People actually strived to enjoy life, and they formed this band. They formed a band like that. And they used to make their own instruments. They used to actually make violins and guitars and so on. And they would play on what you would call reservations. They would go and play, and they'd hold dances out under the night sky in the open for that local group. Now that band came from a place called Purfleet, and Purfleet has a reputation for being one of the most terribly depressed communities in Australia, one of the most. And I came there and I had this photo, and I said, look, I've got this photo here. They said, we want you to do an art project. And I said, well, I'm not an artist. And then they said, no, we really want you to do it. So I came there and I had a photo, and I said to them, are all these families, are they still here? That photograph was taken in 1909. I said, are any of these families here? And they said, yeah, all these families are still here. They're big, in big numbers. So I went around and started to talk to people and said, this is what I want to do. I want to turn this black and white photo into a pointillist type painting. And I said, all I want you to do is come and finger paint this painting. And some people were saying, oh, well, that's terrible, that's like kids stuff and this whatever. And I said, no, but what it means is none of these people might think of themselves as artists. In fact, they might not be artists or painters. They might be very old people who have never painted. They might be kids who have never painted, but they can put their fingerprints and their DNA into this painting. So the schools next to me, this gallery, then brought their kids in. There was these kids were teenagers. They were high school kids and then primary school kids. In all, 38 members of the local community that were direct descendants of this group came in, and we would give them a cup of tea and talk to them, and then they'd talk about, well, that's my grandfather there, or that's my grandmother. And we asked them to sign a book. They'd sign a visitor's book and say who they were. But it was one of the most beautiful projects I've ever done, and it's in a very tiny, insignificant place in many ways. Purfleet, no one talks about Purfleet. No one certainly doesn't do any art about Purfleet. And it just turned out to be this incredible painting. And they then said, the gallery then said, well, look, that's your painting. And I said, no, I'll donate that to the gallery. So the gallery has colonial paintings of that district. They have Aboriginal people in colonial paintings of that district. And I said, well, you now have this Aboriginal painting of the Aboriginal people of this district in very contemporary terms. And it's now in their collection, and they displayed it during National Aboriginals Week in 2009, 100 years after that photograph was taken.
So, there you are, in the final meeting. Okay, so we are at the end of our time, and as you know, we could go on for another hour, and we had more to show you as well. Thankfully, John will be speaking again tomorrow afternoon, and on a panel, and we can just please hold your questions for that time, because we actually have to evacuate this room in about 5 minutes. So I just ask for your cooperation with that. But for me, it is such a joy to listen to John talk. His wealth of knowledge, the way that he has really eschewed personal recognition to work with groups of people and bring them together in collaborative art expressions and things that really draw attention to Indigenous people globally. He's really made such a difference in the world of Aboriginal art over the past 40 years, and it's such a privilege to have him here with us and to learn from him tonight. So please help me thank John.
There is a donation box.